I really want to show my respect to everybody and say hello to everybody on this little Zoom presentation for today around the planetary boundaries. I think is really important conversation to be had, and I really I get blown away every time, and I keep on blowing his balloon up. And Ian Lowe is just brilliant. I just love listening to him. And Will Stephen, and I really appreciate both you gentlemen showing due respect to the traditional owners and to how we fit into the landscape and the processes, and our contribution to any sort of global effort to make change when and everybody doing their little bit. So I really highly respect both of you very much, and thanks for that. One of the, I guess the things, and I jotted down all these notes prolifically, and that probably don't fit into the equation of my presentation, but you talked about colonisation, and particularly in Australia, and we'll keep a focus on Australia for us, because colonisation started with us as people, but also the place. The contribution of non-Indigenous people to Indigenous people and place has been very destructive, and there's no sign of let up, as people probably would have seen in relation to the destruction of a really sacred, important site in WA by the likes of Rio Tinto, and that the legal rights of companies far outweigh people, place and values and sites. So understanding country, I think one of the critical things for me is over the years we've as Indigenous people have learnt that understanding country is critical, and that understanding has got to be is broken down into, I guess, three things that we do with future dreaming. And that is the three disciplines, and that's we have a relationship with our country and in each other. We have respect for that, and we also have reciprocity. And I think one of the things that and we've got to start doing ourselves in terms of our relationship with our environment is to build that relationship with our environment, show respect for our environment, and show respect for that relationship. But also build reciprocity within in the planetary boundaries, and that's understanding our planet and share the benefits. And that's how we've operated as Indigenous people, is sharing those benefits and opportunities. But further, before I go, I want to acknowledge the elders, families and forebearers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of the Australian continent, islands and adjacent seas, who remain spiritual and cultural custodians of their lands and waters, and who continue to practice their values, language, beliefs and customs. It's really important for me to do that. Is one of the integral parts of a relationship. And when you're talking about nation states, we had quite a few nation states within the continent. Some people would have seen this map before around the language groups and tribal groups within, or nation states within Australia or the continent itself. So there were quite a few different groups, 300 and something odd groups, but there was also about 640, I think it was, around languages and dialects and so forth. So it's a continuation. And if you have a look at that landscape, it's actually the bigger the boundaries, it also covers a lot of bioregions and ecosystems as well as a part of that, and I'll have a bit more of a conversation a little bit later on. This one was really interesting, and I just wanted to try and dilute some of the ignorance around Indigenous people in place, and a lot of this relates to language, where people still use their language quite a bit, and some of these groups in some of these communities where the English language is actually third or fourth language. So their cultural connection is very, very strong. It's not to say that the Indigenous people that don't use their language don't use words, and words are quite often used. amongst us as First Nations people. So, but regularly within these particular locations, dialects and languages are often used. So if we think that Indigenous people are almost extinct, for the want of a better word, I can say that. But all languages, it's like Arakan, for instance, in the Western Cape, where there's 5 groups and they speak 5 different languages and dialects inside that group. It's commonplace up in the Cape, for instance, where I spend a lot of time. I've learnt my trade, learnt the skill, and was taught quite a bit from those old people. So that's gives you a bit of an interesting little picture. Not many people have seen that picture, but it's a kindly reminder that, and I should say that people are building back their language groups and languages back. So that's really important. For the students, I like to use this as the true size of Australia, which obviously is all these nations that actually fit within the parameters of Australian landscape. So I think they're really surprised where you got Austria and Finland and Spain and Switzerland and all these nations, Italy, they all fit in to the Australian continent. So it gives a perspective that the landscape and the biodiversity and the bioregions are hugely diverse, but we have a different landscape in Australia. And that landscape is based on our relationship with that land. So it's harsh, whether we like it or not. It's not like Europe and it's not like anywhere else. So then I talk about Aboriginal people in Australia have a complex system of law and laws. Long before the establishment of British law in Australia, the systems of law is often referred to traditional law. Law, however, rules the law of the appropriate behaviour. So it tells us what we can and can't do, how we interact with people, how we interact with the environment. And this keeps on going and it continues. And that's that relationship. And non-Indigenous Australians since colonisation have really tried to be very destructive of our relationship to our place and to our environment, and try and give us a disconnect. That disconnect can come in many forms, and that still continues today. Is it appropriate? Absolutely not. Do we like it? No. But it's reality. But what we are in is we've got one planet, and so what we're trying to describe is we have one planet. What we do individually within those patterns or pattern of our planet is what we should be looking at doing. So caring for country is often described as an Aboriginal thing. It's not an Aboriginal thing. Caring for country is about all of us. It's a collective. We all have a responsibility around how do we actually look after Mother Nature. And, some people might say it's hairy-fairy when you talk about Mother Nature. It's sort of kumbaya stuff. No, it's not. Mother Nature describes how she is, what she does, whether you're upsetting her, whether you're impacting on it. So it gives us messages continuously. So when we talk about the actual landscape and the change of the landscape or the planetary boundaries are changing constantly. There's never one planet. Well, it's a time and space, and we see it happening every single day. If we let off a nuclear weapon right now, somewhere in the South Pacific, that would change our atmosphere and change everything. So the planetary boundaries and acceptance within that is very critical right now. And our environmental, cultural, social responsibility to place and people. When we work to assist the environmental landscape, it's not a job for us, it's an obligation. We have an obligation to the planet. We have and when we talk about planet, we talk about our country, our place. Science uses all the fancy words, ecological, biological, all these scientific terms, but it means the same thing for us. It's the same with the argument with Professor Lowe and with Will. It's the same thing. We're all got different ways of looking at it, but we're all going towards the same, wanting to go to the same solution. And we put over a different lens. This one is a different, like an Indigenous lens. So caring for country describes a symbiotic relationship between us, First Nations people, and the environment in which we live in. So we see it the complexities of the environment in a very, very different way. Science is really just catching up to us. So they haven't passed us yet, but they are catching up. They are understanding exactly what we're saying. And the great thing about it, when having people like Professor Lowe and Stefan on, is that they get it, they understand it, and those complexities, and they've been able to dissect it in a very critical but very strategic way in understanding it and then putting it back together from a human-centered approach and an environmental approach, more so than a human-centric, because humans have got to understand we're just a species within the framework of the planetary system, and we're not the dominant species. It's often said, I think one of the critical things that I'll always say, and sometimes it might upset a few people, but I think we stupidly think that we are the ultimate power over the environment, and that the environment will expose us as being really stupid. And it's starting to do that way now. And that, and the way it operates is, sadly, is that there's going to be a supposed supernatural being that's going to come and save us all once we destroy it. I'm here to tell you that, yeah, okay, no further on that. But you know where I'm going. There's no such thing as a supernatural power where we just self-destruct as human beings. And sadly, I've seen it, our self-destruct, and we're to a point where we have actually met tipping points on some things on this planet already, and that's very telling from an environmental point of view. Once you add all those things together and they become a conglomerate, then we're in real serious trouble. So there's an interconnection between spiritual and cultural and physical for us as Indigenous peoples. And when I say Indigenous peoples, not all Indigenous people have, some people have been removed from their culture and their relationship to country and to their spirituality. It's not a fault of theirs, it's a fault of the system in terms of colonisation. And some people just get tired and fatigued from arguing the toss and wasn't it. And what I try and describe with people is to say, okay, how well do you know your environment? How well do you know your landscape within your region? So if I was to say to you, would you have enough knowledge to go out, find water, or find a location where water would be, where food would be, if you needed to survive for 6 months? It's a real powerful sort of a statement, because not many people know. Water comes out of a tap. Yeah, okay. Food comes out of the fridge or out of the pantry. If that was all not there, if you had to survive within the environment, would you be able to water yourself and feed yourself? And that's a very challenging thing. And it's even challenging for Indigenous people. We describe our environments in sort of the 6 seasons, if you like. Our raccoon, for instance, has 7 seasons. So there's subtle arrangements in terms of environment. This is the sort of knowledge that we can use together as a collective to understand how our region and how our landscapes work. When we're talking about Australia, we're talking about how do we, as a people, work out our landscape here in Australia? What do we need to do? The landscape is very different to anywhere elsewhere around the planet. So we have a very different environment to which we are. Now, they talk about deep winters and deep springs. True spring, it's just a way of an English version of how you would describe late summer and all the waters and so forth. And when animals come on, the seasons for animals, we know when they're on, we know when they breed, we know all these type of things. So it all goes towards environmental health and that whole social and emotional well-being for Indigenous people is being on land, caring for land. Is it economically viable? Probably not, but you have a cultural responsibility. I always say, well, when we go out bush, we always use the 5 senses: eyesight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. But if you don't have smell and you don't have taste, then you've got to go and get checked for COVID. Seriously, you might be in trouble there. So, but all jokes aside, it's the whole sensory perception around your own landscape, your own environment. It's getting to understand what your environment is around. There again, it's about that relationship. And once you understand in your own region and your local area, you start to understand the complexities as it spreads out along Australia. So it's like, you know, knowing what's in your local area, knowing how you want to interact with that environment, knowing how to understand that environment, read that environment, and then that has applications right across, just like fire management as well. The fire management, or the principles of fire management, and is very similar in terms of there's different landscapes. Like you might have fire, like ironbark, for instance, in the north is a little bit different to the ironbark down south, but the principles are basically the same around the plant species and so forth. I'll leave that up for another day. Water lilies, it always fascinates me. You know, you look into a water lily ponds and you think it's quite beautiful. For Indigenous people, we look at the landscape in a different way. The billabong is a supermarket or a pharmacy. And we understand what that supermarket looks like. So there's a whole lot of plants and you know, grasses and yams and so forth that we eat within that sort of billabong area. There's also plants there that are pharmaceutical plants that we utilise. The bush is quite plentiful in terms of what we do. I'm not saying that you go out and look for all this and look for all bush foods, but what I'm saying is the basic principles are there. We live within a sustainable part of our environment, and they've got bush food plants and that sort of stuff that's available. So, you know, I guess the thing is that we don't have a planet B. We have a planet A, and that's what we're living on at the moment, the blue planet. So, and strategically, we've got to look at it from a different perspective. And so, you know, we have wattles all the time. We have seeds and food and medicine. So, you know, there's a whole derivative within our landscape. All that's being destroyed, or quite a bit of it's been destroyed through landscape, through destruction and so forth. So there's movements of fish and just trying to describe exactly what we see from a different perspective, whether it's barramundi movements or whether it's stingrays when they're fat. There's all signs, environmental signs, that we're happy to provide if science wants to see that and put this whole map of our environmental and biodiversity integrity map together so that we can collectively understand what sort of type of impacts we're having as human beings. And we're trying to develop a non-biased understanding of the landscape. Look, I get the fact that there's been a lot of attempts, and not everybody likes or is diametrically opposed to everything that we do and say as Indigenous people. But the reality is that it's just trying to remove us from our planet and from our landscapes. What we try and do is make sure that, you know, we don't have the answers to the destructive nature of greed. We don't have all the answers to the global destruction of our human home, but we can show you how to conduct yourself or ourselves in our environmental boundaries of the Australian continent, which is fundamentally different, and then have that application as a broader environmental application across the planet. I describe, you know, trees and how they're just homes. You know, people look at trees and think, oh yeah, that's a beautiful tree, it's white, got leaves. I see that in a different way. You know, birds, bees, possums, grubs, snakes, all it's life. It's a part of their infrastructure within their planet. This is their planet. This is their environment. This is their whole environment. And they're medicine, shade, water, and we use it for tools and weapons, and even down to things like trees actually singing, grass singing, all those sort of type of things. It's understanding where we are inside the planet. There's leaves, branches, barks, sap, roots are all a planetary thing for a lot of these species. So when we saw that destruction of with the fires and the loss of those species, and in particular right across those landscapes, and the potential for some of those species not to be available anymore, is a sad reminder that we've got to really button down in terms of how we behave with our planet. And Michelle showed the eco-ego sort of type stuff, and I think that doesn't need any explanation. And there's one thing that I always like here is the world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything. And I think that applies to every single person on this webinar, and people who want to make change a difference. And Katherine's sort of donut sort of made sense to me around the social foundations of in relation to poverty, and it's trying to stay within that green realm, if you like. A lot of Indigenous communities, particularly in remote and regional locations, below the poverty line. But what they're trying to do is go back to country, look after country, and understanding what that looking after country. So it's their contribution to a small way to how the change in planetary boundaries, and how we want to make our little contribution to the way we protect our environment and protect with all the species within that environment. And how do we then regulate our human behaviours, and how do we as a species make choices, and make those choices wise choices? Because at the end of the day, we are change agents. If we want to make a change, and we are change agents, and we can't let little things or big things, corporations and so forth, interfere with our ultimate goal, and that's to change our behaviour and change our patterns, because we're talking about our planet, our mobs, and we're talking about the future. And I'll leave it at that, Michelle.
Thank you, Rob. Before we kick into questions, I wonder, little claps, thank you. I wonder actually if you could go back to your map of Aboriginal Australia. Would that be? Sorry,
yep, I can.
Torturing you to share screen again.
No, that's all right.
I have a couple of questions to start with.
Yep.
Others, yeah.
Let me go back then.
Thanks, Ross.
All good. That one.
Oh, it hasn't come up yet, Dal. Did you?
Oh, hasn't it?
Yeah, maybe I opened it, but you've got to reopen the share screen. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's right. I will. Where are we? I'll close now. Just got to try and figure out how to exit. I'm sorry,
Ross.
Now.
Look, I can ask the question. You don't have to show it. What I wanted to do was bring that beautiful map of Aboriginal estates into, I guess, the forefront of my question, which is this remarkable similarity in many ways between the sub-bioregional map of and I know that the Aboriginal map of Australia is not in any way perfect, and a lot of groups will say that it was created by non-Indigenous anthropologists, so it's flawed, but it does actually show the many hundreds of language groups that exist on the continent. And yet, for someone like me, my question to you is, sorry, nearly there. Well done. Yay. No, not that one.
Going too fast now.
There we go. When you look at a map of Australia with the sub-regions and the bioregions from Western science's point of view, you can already see that, for millennia, Aboriginal communities lived across the continent in a bioregional or a sub-regional kind of way, probably different classifications for different reasons. But are you able to comment a little bit on, in your own work life, visiting up to Cape York and working in other places in Australia, some of the differences that you've seen across different Aboriginal communities on different kinds of country, just the things that you've seen that are, very deeply embedded in place?
Yeah, I thought you were making a statement. I didn't think it was a question.
My questions are very long. I apologise.
Yeah, no.
It's about the differences between groups in different places, so you can contrast.
Yeah. Well, the general principle around understanding country is really understanding yourself within the landscape, and if you can understand yourself within the landscape, so that and those bioregions really were if you actually go down deeply, there's a whole variety of different landscapes, waterways, creeks, rivers, and different types of vegetation and so forth. So, and people moved around. So, and those landscapes are really important. How they look after them is different, but the principles are the same. It's like you have a totem. You have a totem for a tree, or you have a totem for plants, or you have a totem for animals. Those are the sort of type of things that you adopt as to look after, to respect and to care for. So you would not partake of that sort of animal, that will be destructive around that plant and so forth. And they moved around in those locations purely because of that some of those places where seasons would come on and come off. That's where we go back to the calendar principle and understanding how your landscape operates. So you would go to variations in places where you'd be able to eat quite comfortably and sensibly. It's like Auntie Mary Graham was saying, if we had domestic animals like horses and we could probably get around a lot better, you know, or camels on the continent, but we didn't have any of that. So we couldn't use ploughs. You can't use a wombat to pull a plough, for instance, you know. So it's the dynamics of that environment. And so we had to live within the confines and the boundaries of that, of our environment and the landscape itself. Without that, it would have been very, very dangerous for us to live within that environment. Now, I know for a fact that some places where we also had severe droughts, and there's recordings of severe droughts, and where regulations around having children, for instance, or breeding, if you would like, to have more in the family was regulated or controlled when the environment wasn't conducive to the upbringing of children in their early years. That's a long-winded way, anyway.
No, that was good. Thank you, Ross. Couple of questions coming in. So Jude has asked, can we please see the detailed seasons diagram again? Maybe, Ross, you could talk a little bit about how different parts of Australia literally have different seasons, and how, you know, the European idea of the 4 seasons is quite inappropriate, isn't it? Oh, you're on mute, Ross. Sorry. I didn't do that. You're still on mute.
I did. I muted myself.
You did?
Talking to myself, so yeah. Having a good old chat here.
Thanks, Ross.
Now, the important thing here, 4 seasons is a European, you know, concept, and that's the variations. In Australia, is a little bit different. In different locations, a bit different too. But when we talk about seasons, we talk about 6, minimum of 6. Sometimes it's 7. I know of locations where there are actually 7 different seasons, and they're all little minor environmental triggers. Whether you're talking about monsoon or the building up of monsoon and pre-monsoon. So you'll actually see on this particular map, pre-monsoon this is a very basic one from WA, and what it talks about is storm and you know, cool and humid, cold times. And I guess what I want to reiterate here too, and a couple of these Indigenous people are saying, well, that map is actually starting to change. The seasons are coming later. So the variations in cold, hot and dry and monsoon seasons are actually rotating. So they're not aligned to as aligned to it as this map here indicates, because of environmental changes that are going on. So this one talks about the late summers, so early winters. It's the same principle, and it's also the 6 seasons. And those seasons are all integral on flowering, understanding when flowers are flowering, what animals and species are available, when they're breeding. And so it tells you even things like the deep winter, for instance. It talks about visitors from the Arctic birds, so we know when they're coming. And we know we're starting to get a bit deep cool. It's like the, I'm trying to think of them birds from the Arctic now. Always come to swampland there where you are, Michelle. They're curlew. It's curlew from Russia, and when it comes down, you know that it's their summer up there, and you know that we're starting to get into our winter here. And they're all signs, they're all pivotal signs. So it's reading country and understanding what those signals are and how that works. I'll go to this one quickly. And this was also described, how do we actually work out our country and what comes on, what's fat, what's ready, even down to our scrub turkeys, for instance, or plain turkeys. We knew when they had worms in them, when they were skinny, so you don't eat them then. We wait till they get, fat up proper way. And then we have, and there's books out there too that explain a lot of this as well. There's different, what's his name? Try to think of his name now. Dark Emu, which is a really good, important book to read as well. So it describes seasons, but there's a lot of this information now that are starting to become available on websites. So, but it gives you an example, it doesn't give you a definitive. The definitive comes from people. And sometimes I'll share it with you, sometimes I won't. Even as an Indigenous person, sometimes they share it with me, sometimes they don't, because sometimes they don't want to let me know, because I might get better at them.
Sorry, Ross, to interrupt, but that's a nice connection to the next question. Alice is asking, excuse me, what are some of the approaches you would suggest for non-Indigenous people to best learn from Aboriginal people and be allies in advocating for Indigenous perspectives and relationships with the environment? And how might we be good allies without appropriating or recolonising Indigenous culture?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. It always hits me between the eyeballs, that one, because it's a very sensitive thing, and some Indigenous people don't want to give away their information because sometimes it's just plagiarised, and some people take it away and use it in a different way and it loses its meaning, and some Aboriginal people feel shame from doing that. One of the critical things about and I'll come back to those three principles, and it also relates to humans, and that's having that relationship. When we have long-term relationships or a built-up relationship with Indigenous people, they'll share when they know when you're ready to be given information. You don't never ask for information. You always wait for when that information is given to you. What's one thing I learned as a young fella, and then you respect that information and you respect that relationship. You don't give that information away. You keep that within yourself, and that you have, and that's that reciprocity. You've got it's a mutual obligation to maintain the integrity around that information that might provide you. They might tell you a certain way, a cultural way of how to see things, or where that animal is, placed within our ecosystem, or our biological and environmental and spiritual connection. That's your information. So it's learning and sharing, and it takes a long time. I don't know whether I mentioned it, but as a Bindal fella from Townsville, I've spent a lot of time in the Cape. And I've spent quite a bit of time with elders and people, and I'm only just starting to build a wealth of knowledge now. And I won't tell you what my age is, but it's been 50 years in the making plus, around how to read landscape, when to read landscape, what the environment tells you. It's really critical, but we don't all have one set of information. There's one thing that you'll always learn, is that I don't have one set of specific knowledge about a particular location that is intimate. That's cultural business. I have a general knowledge of landscape and cultural business within those locations. So you have a good knowledge of cultural heritage, you have a good knowledge of artwork and a whole broad range of stuff. But the specific stuff I don't tell anybody about, because that was consciously applied and given to me.
Thank you, Ross. And just following on from Alice's question, how would you suggest non-Indigenous people work most effectively with Indigenous people in Australia to either be work colleagues or allies? You talk about building a relationship. Did you want to talk a bit more about that, so that non-Indigenous people on this call can be thinking about?
There's organisations that are around, Indigenous organisations. There's also, if you want to learn about fire management, you go into the Fire Stick group, and actually a good thing to do is Google your local area to see what groups are in that area, and try your best to form a relationship that is based on respect. And a lot of non-Indigenous people have a tendency to go in and think they know everything, and that's a danger. So I'll tell you the danger parts. But if you go in with mutual respect and sit with people and listen and learn, that's the biggest thing. If you can listen, you've got to use your ears. These things on the side of your head is really critical. And that's what I keep on telling people. And I don't mean to be demeaning, but it is such an important tool, these two things here, to actually listen. And then you'll gradually get a relationship with those groups. They might be local land care, they might be local rangers. You might come across Indigenous rangers that are in national parks or protected areas. They might actually look after their own landscape as well. So you might want to, spend time, go around the appropriate ways of actually getting in contact with them. You might know somebody locally. Each person has a different relationship or a different way of connecting with people. But always remember, you've got two big things on the side of your head, and if you use them really well, you'll form a wonderful relationship. And Michelle can tell you all about it. Her ears are getting big because that's how she learns from Mob too. She listens.
Oh, thank you, Ross. You said I've got big ears. I'm proud of that. Proud moment in my cultural learning. No, and certainly from a non-Indigenous perspective, in my early 20s, I was lucky enough to be connected to a family in central Queensland, and through sitting and listening with those folks and becoming friends and mucking in and helping their organisation and volunteering and just connecting and learning, and it sort of changed my life and made me much more open. And certainly I think what Ross is joking about is a very serious issue. If those of us who are non-Indigenous want to play a part in decolonising our own communities and our own society, part of that is it's the listening with respect and becoming friends. It's not just about a service delivery mechanism. Thou shalt give me knowledge. It really is about the relationships and making the time to connect with people through work, through your local area, and just building those relationships for the long term. Certainly that's how Ross and I met 20 years ago and continue to work together, and with many, many other people. So thank you. That was a lovely question and a really nice answer. Thank you, Ross. There's a question from Penny. She says, do you see any of the joint management agreements or the establishment of IPAs, which I think she means Indigenous protected areas, do you see any of them across the country as commitments by government to create space for ecological and social resilience? Do you think that they prioritise Indigenous land management practices? So what do you think of IPAs and joint management agreements, Ross?
Yeah, look, I can give you the diplomatic answer, or I can give you the answer from a blackfly, but this time I'm going to give you from a First Nations standpoint. I've been heavily involved in IPAs over the 30-odd years that I've been involved quite heavily in the environmental aspect. IPAs was always a get out of jail card for a lot of governments, because Indigenous people wanted to look after country, look after landscape. They got fatigued from the badgering that continued from that, and then the actual legislation was made in a way that created a power balance with Indigenous people to understand and develop their relationship with the landscape and revisit how that landscape should be looked after and repaired. Unfortunately, the IPA process, the balance of power remains with government, because they're the financial institution which gives or provides resources to the management of that. So they can regulate and control exactly what goes on in IPAs, which is a very disappointing thing. But Indigenous people over the years have started to work out that IPAs, if you use it in a very strategic way and develop some recognised key performance indicators, if you like, government then will have a tendency to listen. In terms of Indigenous protected areas, even in Queensland, and joint management, to me, well, it's a misnomer, because the power imbalance still remains with government. They still control everything. So the responsibility for management of the parks, even though it's a glossary or, stick a uniform on an Indigenous person, therefore they become, they're a part of the system and a part of the institution. It's one of the difficult things. And I can say that firsthand because I was quite heavily involved, or I was the lead evaluator for the Cape York Joint Management Evaluation only just over 12 months ago. And that was quite an ugly process. Goes to show that but no matter what you call it, it is a glossary for non-Indigenous people to hang their hats on. And look what we're doing for all these blackfellas. But Indigenous people see it in a very different way in terms of on ground. They're saying, well, we're here, we're on our landscape, we're looking after our landscape, and that's an important thing for us right here, right now. So because we're on land and because we're looking after country, the government can, the hierarchy within the bureaucracy and administration can do what they do.
Interesting. Thank you, Ross. Andrew has asked, could I ask approximately how many active Aboriginal languages there are in the country? I was amazed to see the map of present day distribution. Did you want to go back to that language map there?
Yeah, it's, I don't know exactly what the actual number, but I could, I'm sure we could find it somewhere. Because there's a number of dialects and stuff that are being used as well, there's quite a few. So if you're really talking, I don't know, looking just at the map alone, it's hard to calculate. But if you're looking at languages and the reintroduction of languages and how people are actually talking language again, it's just an interesting layer. I don't know, but I would certainly, that will definitely be, I'll preload for the next time somebody asks me that question. I think it's a very valid question. But these areas definitely do speak their own languages and are bringing back. You'll even notice in places like, around Sydney and parts of Brisbane and thing as well, where they only just talk a language. It's just, and they'll talk English to non-Indigenous people, but most of the time they're actually speaking language. It's fascinating to watch because when I grew up in, sort of down in southeast Queensland area, out west, out at Charleville, you were flogged. My father was actually physically flogged and put in a tin shed for speaking language, and he was locked up in that for a couple of days. So that's the cruelty of using language, and you had it beaten out of you. But some people just kept on going and going and going, and language survived. And unfortunately, when my dad started having us as kids, and he still had that fear of not using language, so we got taught by uncles and aunties elsewhere to understand what language was and how it meant. Short, that's a long answer.
It's a very complex issue, isn't it?
It is.
I wonder if, as part of that, and to connect to the next question, Ross, can you go yet again to the map of Aboriginal Australian estates? Or yeah. So, Ross, I know when we do our workshops with Mary Graham, she says there were hundreds of major language groups, and obviously inside them there were dialects. Some people say 500, some people say 600 language groups. But it's fair to say that there were a lot of connectivity across the continent, as well as different dialects inside pockets and places and regions. Did you?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
the languages, we had 640, I think, from when I was a young kid. There was about described that existed. Within there was something like 300-400 different dialects, communication techniques and lines. But there's, what I found quite fascinating is that quite a number of the words that I used, or that Cape York used, is actually found also in places like the Kimberleys and Northern Territory, and Northern Territory at the top end around Arnhem Land, but had a different meaning. So, but the language is also described a storyline. So that storyline would also go as far as, and I know one storyline that goes from the Cape York right down to New South Wales, to the Riverina area, and then cross over into WA near Perth, in Kalgoorlie. And that's that storyline. So it's incredible how language works and how you can use language, and the transition of language can go across. Now, there was a variety of different words too that we used. Depending on how you said it, had a completely different meaning. So you had to be very careful on you know, the word, the expression of the word, but how you actually rolled your tongue, for instance, or how you said it could have a completely different meaning, and it could get you into trouble. Because there's, I remember growing up as a kid, I used a couple of those, tried to use a couple of those words, but I said them wrong, but I was saying rude words. So rather than them proper words, you know. And I had to be taught how to roll my tongue or how to say it, and using those sort of sounds and what's name. So language is fascinating, and it's coming back in many of those places. Kuranda, for instance, in North Queensland, up from Cairns, they teach all those kids in that school, in the Kuranda, not all the kids at school know Jabberkai language. Don't matter who you are, they all know Jabberkai language. So, and that program's been going for what, about 25 years, the language program inside that state school. It's been brilliant. But all them kids learn it.
Excellent. Thank you, Ross. And before you move off that map, Gethin has asked, are there smaller clan or family, for example, divisions within the nation states?
Absolutely. Even though I call myself Bindal from Townsville area, there is 8 different clans within inside of the Bindal group. So we all dispersed over different landscapes within that area between there and the Burdekin River, and up to Mount Elliot and out to and further to the range. So we had about 8 different clan groups, so that we didn't all pressure one particular environment or you know, sticking in each other's pockets, really. You can certainly wear out your friendship by doing that if there was large crowds, but we'd get together for food time, for dance time, for corroborees, that type of stuff. We have groups coming from as far as Cardwell and so forth. So all groups, language groups and clan, we would have clan groups within inside those. They were all small groups that didn't impact on the environment as much as we would now, because of that specific ability to move around in those locations. And so there's a small footprint on your locations and on your environment.
Thank you, Ross. I'm just aware of time, so I've probably got time for one more question. Apologies to anyone who asked a question further below, but I'll connect those questions to Ross later. Excuse me. Jack has asked, I think it's a point of clarification. He says, Ross, early in your talk, you said that caring for land is not economically viable. From an Indigenous perspective, caring for land and ecological health is central to human well-being. Is it always true that caring for land isn't economically viable? Perhaps you could just clarify what you meant.
Yeah, when I talk about economically viable, I mean, the basic, if you like, the wage or economics around looking after country is very small compared to if you're on a, you know, you're running a tourism operation or you were running a whole variety of different operations. The integrity around the economic environment in terms of European dollars and cents, whereas Indigenous people, particularly in regional remote areas, might look after parks and stuff like that, but they also have a semi-subsistence lifestyle as well. So they'll go hunt, fish and gather a whole variety of things to help with their economy. If you look at living in remote areas and regional areas, the price of things is just quite horrendous. So the economics of scale, but it's an obligation, and people don't mind doing it. And I get the sense with that when I'm working with rangers all the time. That's all they want to be. They just want to be rangers. They don't care how much they get paid. You know, as long as they can put a bit of food on the table for their pickaninnies and so forth, and you know, and put food on the table and get their kids clothed and educated. Those are the basic principles for humanity. And when Katherine was talking about in that social foundation, poverty line, that's where many of these regional and remote areas and people in that sit economically. I did an evaluation around the semi-subsistence lifestyle some 25 years ago, how to supplement and how Indigenous people have continued to hunt and gather and how that supplemented a lot of their food sources. The economy of scale is completely different. Those food sources are really rely on those food sources, the native food sources, as opposed to the shop ones.
Thank you, Ross.
Hopefully that's answered the question.
I think, and also in the talks that Ross and Mary Graham gave last week to the New Economy Network, there was a discussion about the sort of pre-colonial economy was a very different structure. It was a deep, complex economic system, but it wasn't based on the monetary value of the natural resources. So obviously it's a very complex and important issue. But look, on that note, Ross, if you'd like to stop sharing screen for a moment, we might all just say thank you to you, and we'll then introduce Gethin. So everyone, thank you so much for being able to still be with us this afternoon. I know sitting on the Zoom call all day can be exhausting in a weird way, but I'd like to really thank you, Ross, for being part of this wide-ranging and complex discussion about ecological limits and caring for country. And look forward to further talks from you and other workshops that we do. But now I'd like very much to hand over to Gethin Morgan. And Gethin, if you'd like to share your screen or get yourself ready, I'll just give a brief introduction. The way Gethin and I met is actually really cute, and it's worth mentioning. I was on Magnetic Island about 2 years ago and gave a short talk about our Green Prince approach and why we, as a governance-focused group or an earth-centered advocacy group, were interested in bioregions. And Gethin came up and started to chat to me and basically indicated that he was one of the people who had helped create the classification system that we see in Western science in Australia. So I was extremely excited to meet him and very pleased to now invite him to give a talk to us. So Gethin, whenever you're ready, if you could unmute yourself. I asked Gethin to share with us today information about the bioregional classification system. A lot of people aren't aware of the amount of work that's been done and how very detailed and important bioregions can be. So you're still on mute, Gethin. Hang on, let's see if I can help. You might have to do it yourself. I'm sorry, I hope you can still see it. The button for unmute is down in the left-hand corner of your Zoom. Can be hard once you're sharing screen. If you want to stop sharing screen and then unmute and then share screen, I know Zoom is mysterious and annoying. There you go. Can you?
I'm having trouble with my mouse. Hopefully that's the end of it.
We can hear you. Hooray.
Good.
Thank you, Gethin. I might hand it over to you. I think I asked you to talk about bioregions as an important way to understand our continent and to think about or to learn about ecological limits. So yeah, thank you so much, Gethin. And if you could introduce your background. I didn't do it in any way justice, the many decades of work you've done. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm still having trouble with my mouse here, I'm sorry. I'll just get this up again.
The slides are up, so I think all you need, is your slideshow.
Screen show, yes. I'll just drag this down so I can. Okay, we're in business.
Yay, well done. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'd like first to pay my respects to the Wulguru Gabar people of Magnetic Island and to the Bindal people of the Townsville area. Express my respect also to their ancestors and express my deep appreciation to be living in this country, and it's driven my career, the care for this country. So I feel very keenly for Ross's talk. So I see bioregions as a really important part of us as colonisers to understand this country. So I'll start with a quick rundown on what they are, why they're important, what other divisions get talked about, and why bioregions are particularly important. I'll spend a bit of time on the history of them because it's not often that history gets shared, so I hope people can stay with me. And then just a quick talk about, for people who aren't quite sure how to get a handle on their natural environment, just a few ways in to start collecting that info. Okay, so bioregions are part of an integrated land classification hierarchy. So it incorporates climate, geology, hydrogeology, landforms, soils, vegetation, and fauna. So some bioregions you can see very clearly. The wet tropics is an obvious one. The mountains catch the rain. It's a refuge for tertiary flora. Lots of endemic species, unique in Australia. But then all the bioregions are unique. The Mitchell Grass Downs is another obvious one. So you can see the wet tropics along the north coast here and the Mitchell Grass Downs out on the shale plains of the Great Artesian Basin. So they're clear, but all the other ones too, when you get your eye in, are also quite clear. They're normally mapped at a scale of 1 to 1 million or larger. So as Ross pointed out, their usefulness is limited by their scale, but they are very useful for what they do, and I'll get into that more later. They've been primarily used for conservation, assessment and planning, and that's what's driven in Australia their derivation, but of course they're much more useful than that. So up on the screen at the moment is the IBRA 4 version. That was the first map produced. Since then, we've gone further down the scale. So bioregions are divided into subregions. Subregions are based on suites of associated land systems, and a land system is made up of a suite of associated land units. And land units are the smallest unit generally used in discussing land in a scientific way. So a land unit, for example, would be the levee along a major watercourse with its slight rise and sandy soils and you know, eucalypt or whatever woodlands on it. Mapping at that scale is very expensive though, and you wouldn't get a land unit map for many places other than particular properties. So I'll just, whoops. I'm just wondering how to go down. Here we go. Okay, so here's an example of a land system map. This is southern Cape York, with over on the left here the Gulf of Carpentaria. These are all the marine plains, the Mitchell River down through here. So all the different colours of the different land systems. The dark green is the current floodplain of the Mitchell River that overflows into these higher, older areas. These are outwash from the adjacent hills. These are deeply weathered sediments and so on. So you can see there's a lot of detail on this map. This is what Ciro mapped across Northern Australia. The boundary here, you can see there's a clear difference from there to here. This is the boundary between the Cape York landscapes, the in situ soils by and large, into the Gulf Plains. And around here, these are all weathered and redeposited soils. They've all been washed down. So each of those land systems is described by its component land units. So there'll be a short description like this, a profile. So here you've got shales underneath, some sand washed over the top, an eroding scarp. Each of them have got their own soils and their own vegetation. All that's described in more detail in the land system books. So this is the depth of the information underlying the classification, which is its strength. It is based on very fine detail, even though they look like coarse boundaries. And because they're so strongly based, they're a reliable framework for predicting the distribution of soil, vegetation, and other attributes. And particularly when you don't have a lot of field information, a combination of a geology map and a little bit of extra information, and you can do a lot of extrapolation. And because it's a hierarchy, you can extrapolate information at different scales. So knowledge about landscape management, especially within subregions, monitoring, condition and trend, all those sorts of things. As I said, the primary purpose for IBRA, the Interim Bioregionalisation of Australia, was National Reserves System priorities. So, sorry, can I go back? Yeah. Whoop. Oh. Okay, so here the bioregions have been used to indicate which have fewest reserves, and quite clearly up through the prime grazing lands of New South Wales and Queensland are some of the worst or least conserved areas in Australia. The subdivisions, bioregions and subregions have been used for a number of studies since they've been established. One of the ones that's important, now can I move, I'll just see if I can move this little thing here. No, I'm not sure how I can get that out of the way, I'm sorry.
Are you talking about, you've got some Zoom menu bar on your screen?
I've got the screen sharing thing there. I don't know if people can see it.
No, we can't see it. We can just see your map. So, okay, yeah.
All right, so this is a map that I prepared with state representatives for the National Land and Water Audit, a landscape stress. So this is a traffic light colouring. So the red is the landscapes, the sub-regions that have been worst affected by European uses, through to the green, the least disturbed. So, you know, if you know these parts of Australia, you can see the devastation wrought in the southeast and the wheat belt of WA. In Queensland, we've used them as a framework for developing tree guidelines, assessing conservation status of ecosystems, assessing biodiversity for state of environment, bioregional planning, and vegetation condition, just to name a few of the uses we've put the hierarchy to. Now, bioregions and their subunits are good for landscapes and processes, but for watercourses and the characteristics of watercourses, we need catchments. So adjacent catchments in a bioregion will have similar biophysical characteristics, but the relative extent of different types of land and the way they're managed in each catchment will lead to in-stream differences. So particularly for things like water quality, such as having the effects of mining or agricultural contaminants. There might be local climatic differences, slight rain shadows or whatever that change characteristics of catchments, and the condition of ground cover and soil degradation, of course. So these are all things that affect stream flows and water quality, and you would measure that on a catchment. But the physical characteristics of the catchment sit within the bioregions. And also at a catchment level, the biota varies according to the hydrology of the catchment, of course, and at an evolutionary scale, the biota present will depend on what the history of that catchment, the evolution of that catchment in relation to adjacent catchments, for example. It's also worth saying that the characteristics of the bioregion or the subregion, they're reflected in the nature of the aquatic ecosystem, so say the substrate of the watercourses. And even the estuarine and inshore marine areas reflect the nature of the adjacent bioregion. So in Townsville, for example, we've got these broad coastal plains and these great muddy flats that extend out seawards of us. In the wet tropics, you go pretty much straight into deeper water from steep rocky shorelines, you know, generally speaking. Historically, most of the data we've got to do with land use on the island has been collected by other divisions, so political or administrative divisions such as local government or electoral. And it's a problem changing the way data is collected to suit the shape of these areas, as you can imagine. And even when you collect at a property level, a lot of properties stretch from either side of a boundary. The way data is collected at the moment, it's very difficult to get condition or trends because summing over those sorts of heterogeneous areas, you just lose any sense of what's changing. So I'll just spend a bit of time, well, the bulk of the talk's on the history of land classification. So just to reiterate Ross's talk, Aboriginal Australians viewed and used the landscape in an integrated way for thousands of years based on accumulated knowledge, combining culture and a detailed understanding of seasons, ecological processes, species behaviour, and lots more that I'm no idea about, to establish sustainable patterns of use. And I think the condition of the land when the Europeans arrived and described, you know, English parklands is a pretty good indication of you know, what we all aspired to in England it would be, and here it was. People had been managing the land this way for years. And certainly the early ethnographic work coming out of Cape York and Arnhem Land made it clear that the people living there at that time on their own land, as they always had, recognised landscapes, and the landscapes were often boundaries between clan groups or nation states. So our early attempts to classify the nation tended to be to a single discipline, and of course the first one was geology, with the economic values at stake, the early gold rushes and so on afterwards, after that. Following that, there were the botanical subdivisions and then the flora divisions. So this is all at a very large continental scale. But for many years, the national knowledge of our resources was extremely limited, and it wasn't really until post-war that broad-scale mapping really got underway, and that was with the land system mapping. There were some early regionalisations. WA in 1944, Gardner, the government botanist, did a preliminary regionalisation combining geology or geomorphology and vegetation. That was one of the very earliest in Australia. A similar one in New South Wales not long after. But very piecemeal and state-based, as are most of our data sets now. So it wasn't until after the Second World War that the northern states got together and decided that the north needed to be populated. And the way to do this was to coordinate development through an understanding of the natural resources. So the CSIRO, the Council for Scientific Industrial Research at the time, was given the job to do the survey work, and they commenced in 1947. And by the end of 1947, their first study had been completed, covering 7 million hectares. The reason they were able to do that, such a large area in such a small time, was that they developed an Australian original approach to land classification. And they viewed that work as foundational. They saw later work being able to build on it, and it has. It was good, solid work. And they continued that work for another 30 years across Northern Australia and other parts of Australia. So they systematically classified the land using its inherent characteristics, so geology, topography, soils and vegetation, with a combination of traverses, representative sites and air photos. They defined 18 land systems, which they defined as an area or group of areas throughout which can be recognised a recurring pattern of topography, soils and vegetation. So that's the map and the land units I showed you earlier. Subsequently, geological mapping got going in the early 60s on a systematic way when the Bureau of Mineral Resources geared up its mapping program, and that's still the only national data set at 1 to 250,000 that we have, which is just as well because it underpins just about all the land resources one way or another. Now, moving on to the regionalisation story, come the late 60s and early 70s, there was the movement in response to the destruction of nature. The national park movement was growing, but there was concern about the loss of ecosystems and that we were losing species, but the national parks were sort of scenic reserves and along the coastal areas and population centres and so on. So there was a push for a representative system of reserves to reflect UNESCO's ambition for biosphere reserve. So in 1974, the Australian Academy of Science held a symposium to investigate how that might be done. And they recommended that a rapid assessment of current and existing reserves be looked at, while more detailed ecological surveys were undertaken. Gough Whitlam, the Whitlam government at the time, had set aside $60 million to buy land across Australia for national parks, and they needed guidance on where to buy it. So they called submissions to the National Estate Committee. It was pretty clear those submissions from the states and the public, it was pretty sure those were not, they didn't cover enough land really to provide any sort of basis for buying land. So they decided to do two things. One was to put out a bit of money for a quick and dirty method, and the other one was to put out money to look at a longer term, more expensive way of rapidly mapping Australia. So the quick and dirty task was given to the recently established School of Natural Resources at the UNE, which was the first of its kind in Australia, starting in 1970. The foundation professor, John Burton, employed a graduate from his first cohort, who was me, and on the recommendation of members of the National Estate Committee, also employed Peter Stanton from Queensland, a forester, ex-forester, with tremendous knowledge of eastern Queensland. So over the next 3 months, we completed a rapid selection and appraisal of key and endangered sites in Queensland. And there's a very rudimentary map. In those days, it was all done by a dedicated technician with a pen and some rub-on lettering. So that was the first bioregionalisation of Queensland, and together with the WA mapping, which was at the same time being refined by Beard, they became the two first regionalisations in Australia. So in trying to pin down where these bioregions were, I mean, remembering there was not much more than scattered land system maps, a scattering of geology maps covering most of the area, and then little bits and pieces of vegetation mapping and so on and so forth. We went back to basics. So the first question is, you know, what is this area more important than that area? And of course, you know, is Mitchell grass more or less important than rainforest, you know? And the obvious answer is, well, you just can't compare them. So the question then becomes, well, where can you compare areas and where can't you? And so instantly the boundaries need to be found. So using Peter's knowledge and the other mapping sources, we followed the reconnaissance approach that Ciro had earlier done over a smaller area. That involved poring over the air photos for the entire state. So we were in Brisbane and we were in and out of the Lands Department 2 or 3 times a week with armfuls of boxes of air photos. And then using whatever mapping we could get to ground truth what we were seeing on the air photos and transferring the lines to a 1 in a million aeronautical map or a number of maps. At the same time, and you can see in the Gulf Plains up here where the land system mapping was available, we did some preliminary sub-regions, and in the Northwest Highlands, the Mount Isa country also, down in the Channel country and so on. So there were some areas you could get to a slightly smaller detail, but quick and dirty, 3 months to do the project, $30,000. And you know, it stood the test of time. It really, 20 years, or what's that, 50, almost 40 years later, the bioregions are not substantially different. In 1977, Ciro, who'd been given $2 million to go on with a trial for a national study of ecosystems, did their trial in South Australia and delivered that very successfully, and it underpins the current South Australian bioregions. But it was expensive, and with the change in government, there were no more, from Whitlam to Fraser, there was no more money and no more mapping. By then, bioregions were being used in Queensland, though. Paul Sattler, who was working with the State Environment Department at the time, started organising symposiums around the bioregions, so the Mulgalands and the Brigalow Belt. So people started thinking in terms of extents and threats and history and where to, and so they were already starting to shape the way people looked at landscapes. I should just, referring back to the Ciro study, one of the reasons it was so expensive, it was the first use of satellite imagery. So it was an interesting time. Technology was moving on very rapidly. Come 1986, the Canadians had mapped 15 ecozones, which is a slightly larger version of natural regions. And at that same year, they used that as a framework for their state of environment reporting. It was the first nation in the world to do so. But in Australia, things had come pretty much to a stop. In 1987, the National Parks Association in New South Wales approached me to do a similar thing that we did in Queensland for New South Wales, because in New South Wales, national parks were primarily chasing land up along the escarpment and the coast, which is where they perceived the threats to be greatest. But the Western Division and the Western slopes were rapidly being degraded and with very few national parks. So using a similar approach, better mapping in the Western Division, a good coverage of land system mapping, I delineated sub-regions, major ecosystems, areas of interest and so on. And in 1989, the Worldwide Fund for Nature funded me to do a similar thing in the New England Tableland. So New South Wales was getting very close to a full coverage of regions and sub-regions by 1992. So the New England Tableland was an interesting one because it's a region very much under threat, you know, over-fertilisation, over-seeding, over-grazing, over-clearing, you name it. And so eucalypt dieback was just rife. And if you look at this map, the approach I took was to say, well, look, just look at two different classes of land. There's the yellow land, which essentially is under a huge amount of stress. they're the more capable lands in terms of erosion and sustainability, but they do need to be managed properly. The balance of the area, the pale green areas are catchment lands. They're steep, they're erodable, they're largely intact, but they are starting to disintegrate from overuse and piecemeal clearing. So they were to be the corridors, the protected lands for catchments, the adjacent areas to buffer and protect protected areas. And tree planting should be concentrated. This pinkish colour you can see in there is where you can see the areas of natural continuity were really being broken up. We were losing the whole centre of the New England tablelands to dieback and tree death. So this was to identify focuses for tree planting, and in the less developed parts, select representative areas and make sure that the clearing didn't extend into those low capability lands. In 1989, the Goss government came into Queensland after many years of Joe Bajelke-Peterson, and they had a policy of rapid expansion of the national park system to increase their representation of Queensland's environments. And Paul Sattler employed me to come up to Queensland and do a similar job to the New England tablelands and the Western Division to the Brigalow Belt. So the first stage was to divide it into sub-regions, primarily using land system mapping and geology, and then derive major ecosystems from the land system mapping. Now, this is where politics started to hit the theory, because the more ecosystems you identify in a landscape, the percentage of representation of ecosystem in the national park system drops. So there's this delicate balance between increasing the national park system, showing that you're delivering good outcomes by reducing the number of unrepresented ecosystems, but at the same time you've got this bloke beavering away in the background generating lots of new regional ecosystems. So the pure hierarchy of bioregion, sub-region, land system, land units were far too fine a unit. There were too many of them. You would never get them in a representative park system. So we had to explore a different scale that could be used at a state level, but be meaningful at a regional level. So there began the long process of the development of the regional ecosystem. So at this stage, the only way you could meaningfully group land units into a meaningful unit was by grouping land units with a similar geomorphology in soils and landform. Now, I'll cover this in more detail in the masterclass on Friday, so I won't spend too much time on it now. So in 1990, the department employed me full-time to go to Townsville and work on developing a representative park system for northern Queensland. So the main initial focus was to start refining those 1975 bioregions and define the regional ecosystems. Now, almost immediately, moving to Townsville, I found the clearing contractors had moved north. They'd moved out of the Brigalow Belt and into the northern part of the desert uplands. There was immense pressure to clear. There was one single application to clear 500,000 hectares across a couple of properties. And the Lands Department, a young officer out in Hughenden rang me to say, you know, I've found koalas, what's going on? You know, these people want to clear and I'm not sure what to do. So we got together with him and local landholders and came up with the first tree clearing guidelines for the state using recently defined regional ecosystems for their area of interest. And the landholders were very quick to accept regional ecosystems because it tallied with their worldview, their landscape view and knowledge of their area. And we successfully negotiated a huge reduction in clearing, a focus on types that could be sustainably cleared to some degree. And that later on, from 95, there was a memorandum of agreement signed between state government departments to develop similar guidelines across the state. And that gave the impetus to really to get the regional ecosystem mapping going, to underpin these new policies that were starting to be developed. In 1993, ANZAC, the Australian and New Zealand Environment and Conservation Council of Environment Ministers, decided to establish a national reserve system using the bioregions as a framework. So that gave a national impetus to get national bioregions together. So the first workshop was held in 1994 with all the states present. The reason was, rather than doing a desk job in Canberra, the reason for getting the states together was not just to get a better product, but to get a product that was going to be acceptable to all the states and therefore would be applied by the states when they tried to get money from the feds to do acquisitions for the national reserve system. And so by 95, we'd completed the first, the interim bioregionalisation, and that's the first map I put up. So before we all got together and rationalised methodologies and boundaries over the state boundaries, regional boundaries over the state boundaries, the states together had 130 bioregions between them. Rationalising over the boundaries, we ended up with 80, and those boundaries continue to be refined as better info becomes available, which is why it's still called the interim bioregionalisation. It will be interim for our lifetime, I suspect. And as Ian said earlier, that interim, in the first National State of the Environment report, the interim bioregionalisation was used to display some of the biodiversity, some aspects of biodiversity. So coming back to Queensland, between 95 and 99, our department put a huge amount of effort into refining the bioregions, the subregions, and developing the regional ecosystems. And it was finally published in 1999, the Conservation Status of Queensland's Bioregional Ecosystems. And it laid the groundwork then for mapping regional ecosystems across the state. At the same time, we standardised terms and reduced the number of land zones down to 12 so that they were uniform across all bioregions, and it gave the framework necessary for the herbarium to comprehensively map. In 1999, Queensland published its first SOE using the bioregions and subregions. In 2001, the audit, I was contracted by the National Land and Water Audit to do a rapid analysis of landscape health at a sub-regional level, and that gave the impetus for me to go around to all the states, combine or help them produce sub-regions, rationalise them across the boundaries, and end up with a sub-regional classification. The bioregions were now well accepted. We needed more resolutions, and the sub-regions were there to deliver it. And that map of landscape stress earlier showed the first use of those sub-regions. The next year, there was a terrestrial biodiversity audit, and here's an example of endemism. I'm sorry about the scale, but of endemism. The left-hand top is endemic acacia species, so you can see concentrated in WA. The right-hand map is endemic to that sub-region, endemic eucalypts across the sub-region, so Sydney Basin, North Coast and Western Australia. Below that, there's in the bottom right-hand corner, that's endemic acacias and eucalypts by bioregion, and then by sub-region. So they're grouped there into bioregion, the number, and the number there are grouped into sub-region. So you can see the resolution of the sub-region very clearly shows where the biggest areas of endemism for those two genera are. The success of the sub-regions gave the impetus for the other states to complete theirs. So New South Wales, other than the work I'd done in the Western New England tableland, still had very coarse bioregions. So they contracted me to help them with the East Coast. And just a page out of the report to indicate just the sub-regions, how they can be easily understood. So the southeastern Queensland sub-region in Queensland is based on the Clarence-Morton sedimentary basin, and it extends down into northern New South Wales. So we needed to join up with Queensland, if you like, on the Clarence-Morton basin, and these are the sub-regions. So just at a simple level, looking at the dominant geologies, you've got basalt cappings, you've got the underlying Mesozoic sediments, you've got the bedrock underneath that, and then you've got wash coming out from the Jurassic and Cretaceous sediments. So very clear geological patterns. Within these sedimentary rocks, you've got some high altitude ones capped by basalt, and you've got low altitude ones with shale outcropping as well, and extensive alluvial systems. So at that very coarse level, you can see the characteristics of these three sub-regions, and then they'll have some common regional ecosystems, but also a lot of unique regional ecosystems. In 2002, the desert uplands in central Queensland became the first of the state's bioregions to be completely mapped by regional ecosystems. We had a series of expert workshops, reviewed the whole mapping, and then we had a coverage that we could start to use for planning. And I'll explain the groundwork for this map in the expert workshop, but just this shows the strength of the RE mapping for public information, if you like. So the red areas are vegetation that's strictly protected under the Vegetation Management Act. The blue are wetlands and watercourses. The pink is low capability lands, you know, poor fertility, erodible, shallow soils, and so on. Conservation significant plants and animals predominate in the green areas. And the only lands of any real sustainability are these small purple areas, these shale soils and the finer textured soils of low relief. So overall, a very degradable region in need of a lot of attention. It also laid the groundwork then to start thinking about integrating the bioregions and a biodiversity strategy. And come 2011, we were working on a draft biodiversity strategy for the state and a conservation corridor strategy for the state. And you can see the desert uplands sitting up here in the middle of the state. The Great Artesian Basin Rim and the Sandstone Ranges running all the way around the edges, all the way up Cape York. And Adani Mine just sitting in there ready to break that eastern corridor there. And all this good work came to an end in 2012 with the election of the Newman government. And I can't see any evidence yet of any recovery in momentum. Similarly, come 2013 and the Abbott government in Canberra, the National Reserve System program, which was the impetus for the bioregional cooperation across Australia. That also was stopped, and that stalled the collaboration that had been getting very strong between the states. But despite all that, we've still got the bioregions and subregions, and there's still a rigorous and transparent framework for understanding, monitoring, and managing Australian landscapes. Now, I've just got a very short section on getting to know your bioregion. Will I go in with that quickly, Michelle?
Yeah, I think so, Gethin. Technically, we're breaking at 3:30, so you've got 15 minutes, but I think most people might be interested in a little bit more of a presentation and then a little time for questions. So.
Okay, well, it's only fairly good. And, you know, my interest, of course, is in the natural landscape, so getting to know your bioregion. So, you know, if you don't know already, you can go onto the Department of Natural Resources, Mines and Energy website, give them a lot on plan of where you're interested in, and ask them to send you an RE map. So they'll do that. You'll get an RE map for your area of interest. The REs on it are identified by 3 numbers. The first number will tell you what bioregion you're in. So if you're in Southeast Queensland, you'll have an RE called 12 point something point something. The 12's in Southeast Queensland. The Sutter and Williams book is the only source I know that's got the full bioregional descriptions and sub-regional descriptions. So that's the one to look at first. And you should be able to find that in the local library. A web search will pull down other stuff, of course. So seeing where those boundaries are, a fun thing to do is go for a drive across your bioregional boundary. See if you can identify it, see what changes, get an eye for it, cross it in a few other areas, you know. And then when you get your eye in, start looking for the sub-regional boundaries. See what changes when you go from one sub-region to another. Then look, the second number is your land zone. So that's your geomorphology. So if, say, your second number was a 2, that's sand dunes. So that explains why you've got deep sandy soils that are always droughty. If you've got an 11, you've got folded metamorphics, and look out for landslips and shallow stony soils, for example. And the third number is the regional ecosystem number. So that's the vegetation and soils. And you can get more detail from the Environment and Science website. There's a regional ecosystem data set with full descriptions of all those ecosystems. On that website, you can also find biodiversity planning assessments. There'll be fauna expert reports, all the threatened species of interest, flora and fauna reports, and a landscape report, areas of high biodiversity significance. There's a protected matters search tool on the EPBC website. The IBRA section there's got other information on the bioregions. So once you've got a handle on these sources of information, you know, download a map of the areas of interest, get to know them a bit better, get to know your species from some of these lists and bird books. And the maps aren't perfect by any means. There's all sorts of definitional issues and so on. So contact the herbarium if you think that there's something significantly wrong, and let them know. But I think the important thing is use these sorts of resources to understand what you're seeing and talk about it. Talk to your neighbours, talk to your friends, use proper names, use scientific names, you know, make it a common language. And make them know how important, you know, the scientific language is. Common names are good, but if you run into difficulties, that's what scientific names are for. All right, well, thanks, Michelle. That's all I've got to say at the moment.
Thank you so much, Gethin. If people could do a little air clap, that would be lovely. Perhaps keep your maps up in case anyone has any questions, Gethin. There's a couple that have already come in. I might start at the last question. Jack has asked, what was the website that you mentioned that you could find the bioregional maps?
Department of Natural Resources, Energy and Mines.
And is that just the Queensland one?
The Queensland one. It's because these maps are now vegetation regulation maps. And that department looks after clearing, and that's where you download the maps from.
Yeah, it's depressing, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And I just wanted to mention to folks who are listening, we'll talk a bit more about this in the Bioregions Masterclass on Friday. But as part of the Green Prints program, we're really excited to be building a very simple to use mapping system. We're using the CSIRO land use mapping stuff where we can overlay the bioregions so that you can effectively, what we're building is something where an ordinary person can type in where they live and the bioregion will pop up. And you'll be able to then have some capacity to see your bioregion, to get information about the bioregion from relevant sites. So we'll be collating the stuff that Gethin talked about, how you can find different ways of understanding your bioregion. We'll be collating that, making it easier for people to find it quickly, but also the map itself will show you major land use patterns in terms of human beings' activities in your bioregion, as well as knowledge about the ecology of the system and the geology. So we'll talk a bit more about that on Friday, because I actually want to run some of the little mapping efforts we've been making past Gethin for his input and advice. So it's one of the goals in our little program is to make it easier for people to easily find out information about where they are. So we'll be chasing all those leads you've just told us about too, Gethin, and checking it against the stuff we've already been pulling out. So.
Yeah, well, let me know if I can help.
Oh, thank you. We will indeed. So there's another question up here. Where is it? Eleanor is saying, what's the largest scale of IBRA maps available, and which would be the desirable one to have a look at?
Well, with GIS, you can sort of generate a map of almost any size. It's just limited by paper size. The biggest IBRA maps I've seen are A3, but you know, when I used to work with the department, we could print out maps of any scale. And if you put the boundaries over, for example, a satellite image, you can end up with a very useful map, subregions and bioregions over a satellite image. You could talk to the herbarium, see if you can get their mapping team to generate a map for you. I'm at a bit of a loss, really. The Department of Lands used to do that sort of mapping, but their capability's been greatly restricted, and it's all sort of web-based now. Yes, look, I'm sorry. They are difficult to access in a lot of ways. They should be far more accessible.
They should be, and with the help of Gethin and the help of other people, we'll be certainly doing our best to make it easier for people to find out all this amazing information about our local ecosystems. And Ross Williams has just made a comment. I just realised Gethin is the author that is the basis for my knowledge across Queensland bioregional programs. Thank you, Gethin. I think he just clicked that the materials he's been reading for a long time have been written and created by you.
It's not my idea of bedside readings, but it is a very useful book. You're going on a holiday, and I can. It's a well-worn copy, Ross. Thank you. I'm pleased to hear it.
Yeah, it was great because you know, I led the acquisition of protected areas and national parks in Queensland for a number of years, and I used all those books as critical mass in terms of bioregions and acquisition programs across the whole state, including down in the southern area for persons who we shall not name. So, but yeah, I just realised, it just dawned on me that yeah, you know, even with Peter Stanton and reading all of his stuff, and Paul Sattler and Rebecca Williams, which is Michelle's actually got my report, by the way, Michelle.
Yes, yes.
But it's but I really it's an honour to actually now realise who you are and the background by which you've really educated me over many, many years. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Ross. Very good to hear.
Yes, I am. And so I've just actually jumped and taken over the screen, Gethin. I hope you don't mind. So some of the maps you showed were wonderful, and the early IBRA 5 and some of the other versions of IBRA. I understand, and from what the work we've been doing, version 7 is the most recent, but James is on this call. He might be able to, and Ruth might be able to confirm. I think a lot of the material on the different state agency websites is actually IBRA 6. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts, Gethin, on where things are up to. We're certainly, in the work we're doing, looking at this, which has the 89 bioregions, which is IBRA 7, and 419 sub-regions. So they're the kind of the foundations for the work we're doing, in which we look at ecological limits at the local level and then connecting that up through to the planetary boundaries scale in terms of the kind of work we're trying to do. But do you have any thoughts or comments, Gethin, on the latest versions of IBRA?
Well, on the NRS site, the latest version they've got is version 7, although they've got a date of 2012 against it. But it is the same number of sub-regions, so it hasn't changed.
Great.
Yeah, look, we used to get together nationally every year or two, or when issues arose, they were always resolved and refined, but I think we can just assume it's static for the moment.
Gethin, when you say we used to get together, who exactly was that?
Representatives from each state. There were 1 or 2 key people in each state that had a good overall knowledge of the state and its diversity, and were either instrumental in devising the sub-regions or understood them very well. And the challenge was to, whenever we got together, was to ensure consistency, and that, you know, if boundaries didn't meet at the state border, comprehensively examine why that was. And a lot of the time it's because most data sets stop at the state border. And, you know, on one side they're mapping something and on the other side they're mapping something else. And you've got to get to the bottom of what they are actually chasing. And then you've got to go back to original coverages of satellite imagery or air photos and, you know, get the boundary you actually want. So it's quite intensive. If you look at the IBRA reports, all the contributors are listed from each state there. A lot of them have not around anymore, or have left the profession. But yeah.
Well, I was going to say, on behalf of the next generation of people who are fascinated with bioregional classification, thank you to you and everyone for the many decades of incredibly hard work, which have brought us to a place where we have this really important set of resources that tell us about country from a Western scientific point of view. So yeah, it's pretty special, pretty awesome.
Thanks, Michelle. And I'll just repeat, I'm thrilled that the AELA is interested, and I'm really interested in the work you're doing. Thank
you, Gethin. We will be definitely bringing you into so much of our development over the next 6 months, where we're really making some progress on the mapping tool that we're developing, so that ordinary citizens can check where they live, what's going on, and then bring in data sets about some of the planetary boundaries concepts, everything from climate, land use, biodiversity, pollutants. We've discovered that the CSIRO Terrier system actually has a connection to the pollutant inventory, so you can actually check which companies are registered and which chemicals they're using and which places, and we want to increase the kind of information that people can access for their local place. So it's pretty powerful if we can get it to work. All right, well, look, it's coming up to 3:30, which is really perfect timing. Perhaps, Gethin, if you could stop sharing. I took over and I thought that would actually kick you off, but it didn't. But if you could, yep, there we go. Then I hope that everyone on this call can, with great respect, give Gethin a great big long distance clap. Thank you, Gethin, for your incredible talk. And I'm looking forward to Friday in more detail about these important systems.